Most places were destroyed and rebuilt, destroyed and rebuilt. Capernaum was never destroyed. Although there was Roman rule here, they didn't come in and destroy the city. I mean, they may have knocked off all of the Jews that were here, but they didn't destroy the city. So this place started to be built up again by the Christian Byzantines in the 4th century. And then what they did was they needed to identify the house of Peter. Look over the railing in that direction. And you can see what looks like an 8-sided structure going around a circle. Take a look there. Within that circle, there are ruins that go back to the 1st century. And they say that that's the house of Peter. So therefore, to commemorate the house of Peter, the Byzantines built an 8-sided structure going all the way around. Okay? Like a church. Why 8-sided? Maybe pertaining to the 8 Beatitudes. Makes sense? Right? Okay. So how do they know? The clue here is called continuity. This was not a town that was abandoned. People lived here continuously from the time of Christ. So therefore, from father to son, from mouth to mouth, people remembered where Peter lived, because he became a very important personality as time went on, with the early Judo-Christians and then of course the Byzantines. So they remembered where his house was. That's why it was so easy for the Byzantines to identify the house of Peter, and they built the first chapel going all around his house, right over there. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Now, this thing here. Okay. You can make fun of it. It looks like a spaceship. Listen, this territory is owned by the Catholic Church. They think they can do whatever they want. This is what they wanted to do. Over the ruins of the house of Peter, they wanted to build a church. And Israel said, no, don't tell us what to do. Listen, once again, you're in Israel. I don't care if you own this property or not, but we got a law here. This law is you cannot ruin ruins. You can't ruin ruins. So they got under an understanding that they won't touch the house of Peter, but they'll build their church on concrete pillars. You see? So therefore the church does not touch the ruins that are here. Understand? Now there is a dais in the center. If you'd like, you can go take a look. There is a dais and like a plexiglass opening, and you look down into the ruins of Peter, the house of Peter. But they were not allowed to touch the ruins. Okay? There you go.
It's quite architectural.
All right. Anybody have any questions? So he would read. Everything that you see here has been manicured. In other words, this was just a dump up until about 60, 70 years ago. The Catholic Church, put some pillars together, because obviously the pillars didn't look like this, and all the capitals look different, and there's one pillar that's written in Greek and another one written in Latin. This got nothing to do with the synagogue from that time. But this is the location and some of the stones that are still here, okay? The synagogue. The term synagogue is a Greek name. If you want to write this down, the term for synagogue in Hebrew is called Beit Knesset. Beit meaning house, Knesset meaning gathering. A house of gathering. Okay? Community was very, very important to the Jews. Because there were many times in history when they were dispersed amongst the nations, but they always wanted to be amongst themselves. Like the Babylonian exile, they took the whole Jewish community to Babylon. And they cried by the rivers of Babylon, but they didn't want to mingle with the pagans. They needed community. How do we get community? We'll build ourselves a community center, and we'll call it a Beit Knesset, a house of gathering. That's your synagogue. Because up until then, there were no synagogues. You had the temple in Jerusalem, and everybody had an obligation to go there. But now you needed, away from Jerusalem, community. Beit Knesset. It was also a place to gather. It was a place to teach children scripture and to read. And it was a daycare center. All right? Beit Knesset. That's what the term for synagogue is. Because synagogue basically is just a Greek name. Of the Beit Knesset, but it would be the black stone foundation that's underneath us. In the 4th century, when the land of Israel was under Christian rule, the Byzantines, they commemorated this site. Why? Because this is where Jesus lived, right? Makes sense. But there was still a Jewish community. They allowed them to continue worshiping. Now, there would have been a separation of men and women. I don't know if you've ever been to a for real synagogue, but if you go into a Orthodox synagogue, there is a separation of men and women. The women could be sitting behind a drape, or it could be a second story. There was a second story here, because you can see the base of pillars right there. So there was a second story. This was a larger than needed Beit Knesset at that period of time. It's humongous. They built it like in the shape of a basilica, like an A-frame. All right? Get the picture? In a conservative or a reform synagogue, men and women sit together. Now, although we saw that diagram of the Ark of the Covenant, it's also very possible that they had their Torah scrolls on a wagon. It would have been mobile. What they would do is this. You always pray this way towards Jerusalem. Okay? You pray towards the east to Jerusalem, all synagogues. So what they did was, although I don't see a place where a cabinet would have been here, there could have been a mobile cabinet. They would bring it to the front of the Beit Knesset right there. They open up the cabinet, and in front of the cabinet there would have been a dais, usually a stone or a wooden dais. The rabbi, this place was blessed. They had an in-house rabbi. Jesus. So he was the in-house rabbi here who did teach. Now, a service wasn't like it is today because the temple was still standing. It was more like, teaching some things in scripture, but it wasn't like a normal service like we have today. That only occurs once the temple is destroyed. Therefore, we had to look for a substitute to pray. That's where the whole term of Beit Knesset comes about, where people pray. But here it was more like religious instruction, learning scripture. But in any event, they would roll the cabinet over here. They would open it up. He would pick his hands up. By the way, the Torah scrolls have to be handwritten, no blemishes, no mistakes, on very, very thin lambskin. Okay? Again, like Pastor Gary said, his limitation of his ministry was Capernaum, Chorazin, and here. There was one period of time he walked all the way up the Phoenician coast and he affronted the woman from Sidon. And then, of course, one time he went up a little bit up this road further north where he went to Caesarea Philippi. But basically, that was it. Then, of course, when we read in Matthew 11, he gets, I'm not going to say he gets angry. It's not cool. He was a little bit disappointed that the 3 places that he was giving his heart to in teachings and everything were not accepting him. They weren't denying him, but they weren't getting the word. You understand? People came from all over the place. They wanted to get healed. Jesus never turned anybody away. But in a sense, it was a bit hypocritical because they weren't really following the words that he said, but I don't mind getting healed. A scenario, a farmer up the hill is going to speak to his wife, Miriam. Miriam, you know that backache I've been telling you about? There's a guy down the road healing people. I'll be back for lunch. That's what it was like. He was becoming overwhelmed by the masses who needed to be touched or be healed. That is why he said those things, because they were not getting the word. And of course, from there he goes up to Jerusalem. Although Jerusalem is south from here, we never say down to Jerusalem. We always say up to Jerusalem. Okay? It's a spiritual thing. These are like lentil pieces into buildings. All right? They're made of limestone, which means that somebody had the means and the money to get building material from someplace else. Limestone is not from this area. It's basalt.
Okay.
Don't be misled. It has nothing to do with David. I don't know why they call it the Star of David. It was a symbol of like two triangles, one on top of each other. It was a symbol that was used sometimes by the Jewish people, but it was not the symbol of Judaism. The symbol of Judaism, the seven-branch menorah. And the only way that people here would have known about that is because they've seen the seven-branch menorah in Jerusalem, and they came back and told about it. Now, in this seven-branch menorah, we can see two temple implements on both sides. An incense shovel and a shofar, a ram's horn. See? This is the symbol of Judaism. So when did the Star of David become officially the symbol of Judaism? This is going to sound really weird. You ready? Medieval Europe. Because Jews were not allowed to mingle with the local population. The Jews always lived in ghettos. Whether it be in Rome or in Venice or someplace else, they lived in ghettos. They were not allowed to be members of certain workers' guilds. They could not own property. They could not serve in the military. They could not serve in politics. Things were very, very limited to the Jewish population, which was education. People are saying, oh, the Jews are so smart. Well, they're so smart because they weren't allowed to work anywhere, and their mothers were like henpecked, at the kitchen table. Study, 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 study. That's why they all became psychiatrists and doctors and lawyers, all right? But their livelihood was very, very limited. And also in these places, they wanted the Jews who were walking about in the communities to be identified. Anybody ever see the Merchant of Venice with Al Pacino? He's a Jewish moneylender, but the Jews had to be identified by wearing red caps. Okay? So therefore, in the medieval period, Jews had to be identified by wearing the star in yellow sewn to their clothing. Wow, deja vu. That's exactly what the Nazis did in the 1930s and the 1940s. They took that symbol that was used all through the medieval period. That's when the Star of David became popular to the Jews. How old is Scripture? I'm talking Old Testament. How old is it? Well, we don't know when it begins, but we know pretty much when it ends. When about does Old Testament end?
400 years.
About 400 BC, correct?
Yes.
So it's going to be like another 400 years when we start to hear about the New Testament. So therefore, if you were living here and you were a good Jew just like everybody else, okay, and you heard teachings from Jesus, okay, when you were here and you were reading scripture, like in the book of Samuel and all that, it talks about, and that would be like 1,000 years before you, right? David, Saul, and all those guys were 1,000 years before you when you were living here. So you were reading about all the events that happened to the Jews 1,000 years before you. Who was the main enemy of the Jews at that time? Like the pain in the side, they lived along the coast. The Philistines. All through those books, it talks about a confrontation with the Philistines. Who were they? Well, they came from Asia Minor. They came from the Aegean. In a sense, the source of the Philistines were Greek. They were pagans, and they lived along the coast. Okay? They lived along the coast. They were mighty. Why? Because they had one thing the Jews did not have. Iron. They had iron swords and iron shields. The Jews didn't have. They worked with bronze. You didn't have iron yet, and that would make the difference in warfare. Also, they were a chariot people. They had horses. The Jews didn't. We were mountain fighters. In other words, you get us in an open field, we're dead meat. But we get you up in the mountains, we're going to whoop you. Okay? That's what it's like. But let's just say that you lived here 2,000 years ago and you were reading about all this confrontation concerning the Philistines. There was a battle when the Jews were already at Shiloh. That was like the center of the Jewish faith, was in Shiloh. They thought it'd be really cool to have a battle against the Philistines and take the Ark of the Covenant along like as a lucky charm. Right? Yep. So what happens is they go to war against the Philistines. Things are not looking good. They retreat. They lose the battle. The Philistines start to loot the dead. And what do they find? The Ark of the Covenant. What a blow to the Jewish people. So in those days, to prove that your God is better than their God, they took the Ark of the Covenant and they put it in the temple. And all kinds of weird stuff started happening, right? All the statues fell on the floors, there was rats running around, everybody got hemorrhoids, okay? And then they moved it to another temple and to another temple. And they said, you know what? Let's put it on a wagon with 2 milk cows and let it free in the valley. If it goes towards the land of the Jews, we know it was the Jewish God that did it. Well, that's exactly what happened. And it gives you a very good description of that in Scripture. Now, this gentleman reading about it said, well, you know what? I'm going to carve that description on stone. Now, he had no idea what the wagon looked like, but since it was the Ark of the Covenant, he thought it kind of looked like a mini temple on wheels. That's 2,000 years old, guys. This is just from reading Scripture. He carved this on stone. Okay, so in a sense, it's showing you that people really did live here 2,000 years ago, and it proves that the Bible is correct because he's taking an inscription from Scripture and carving it on stone.